mention a couple moments ago, it is Father's Day, so we do set aside some time today as a culture broadly to think about and appreciate our fathers. So happy Father's Day to all the dads and grandparents, grandfathers and stepdads, and anybody else who's ever raised a kid. You're appreciated, and we'd like to acknowledge you today. As we're looking at the Bible a lot of times, one of the things we see very frequently, and in fact, when we're praying and mimicking Jesus, a lot of times we'll call God our Father. That's a very common thing. But as with most common things, I wonder if we actually think about it very much. If it's something we kind of take for granted. Of course God is our Father, right? That's what we've always said. That's how we've always described Him. So where my lesson studying preparation brought me today was trying to figure out, not necessarily the first time that happens, but where it comes from in terms of the significance. If you want to know the first time that chronologically in the Bible God gets called our Father or somebody's Father, it's actually in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 22. And in that verse in particular, God is commissioning Moses to go back to Egypt, where he left, and to meet his brother Aaron and start their whole process of asking for the Israelites to be freed from slavery from the Pharaoh. And God says, I'm going to harden the Pharaoh's heart, but you are going to say to him, Israel is my firstborn son. Let him go, let him be free. And so that's the first time that God gets called our Father. And in fact, it's him asserting that he is Israel's father in that moment. So when I was reading that, I thought, well, yeah, that makes sense, and also reflected ahead to something that I remembered from Jesus' life, and you may remember this as well, that when they left Herod's persecution of the baby boys and fled to Egypt, and Joseph took them down there for protection, the Bible says that this was to fulfill what was said by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son, right? And it's speaking about Jesus. So that led me to ultimately where we're going to read today, and that's in Hosea chapter 11, which is where that prophecy actually occurs. That ultimately gets fulfilled in Jesus, but also harkens back to that original Egyptian captivity that the Israelites were saved from. Just a little bit of context for the prophet here and what we're looking at in Hosea. As I mentioned, we'll be starting in chapter 11, but if we're looking at the beginning of the book, Hosea is really kind of a tragic figure. One of the things he's asked to do as part of his prophecy, the first thing that we see when we're introduced to him, is that God says, go marry a prostitute. Okay, sorry, what? Now, the question that some people come across when they read this is, this literally happened? Did he actually marry a harlot and go through all of this process? Probably, but that's not important. What's really important is the message that came from God because of what he went through. Now, God has asked his prophets to do some really stupid stuff, which is really stupid sounding to us anyway, really extreme stuff. Elijah, one of the most famous prophets, had to go live in a cave and be fed by birds for a few years. Another prophet laid down on the ground and made clay sculptures of the city of Jerusalem out of human poop. So there was a lot of weird stuff that went on in the Old Testament. Getting married to a prostitute is probably one of the least weird, is my point. Although as painful and as extreme as it may seem. One of the things that happens, though, is that Hosea fathers 3 children with this woman. And the first one's name translates to, is Jezreel, which refers to some bloodshed, the sacrifice of people that went on at Jezreel under Jehu's watch. And then the next kid is named Lo Ruhamah, which means She has not obtained compassion. So basically, it seems like there were these two greetings, right? That like you would say to a woman, ruhama, which means you have received compassion, or like, take care kind of a thing, maybe as an oversimplification. And then to men, you would say ami, which means my people. Like, hey, we're brothers, you're one of my people, right? And so Hosea has to name one of his children the opposite of the greeting you would give to a girl. You have not received compassion. And he names his son Lo Ami, meaning you are not of my people. So you get like the opposite of the greeting you would give to one of your male sort of clansmen, kinsmen. So looking at that, basically it looks like God's rejecting his people, right? God is saying, you are not my kids. You're not part of my family. You're not my people. But I think part of what we have to ask when we're asking, why is God called our Father, is what does it mean to be a father? It's really easy to become a male parent of a child. It doesn't take a lot of commitment at all. In fact, with modern technology, you don't even have to be present. They got refrigeration and everything else. They'll transport the necessary goods to the person, make a donation, and move on, right? It is not hard to be a male parent. But if you want to be the father figure in someone's life, if you want to raise them, if you want to nurture them, if you want to be considered a father, you need extra steps. That's why I went through the bother of mentioning not just male parents, fathers, but grandfathers and stepdads and whoever else when I introduced Father's Day today, because sometimes the guy we call dad isn't necessarily the guy who we got our genetic material from, right? Sometimes the person we consider our father is much more important to us because of the relationship we have. And though God is responsible for creating us, right? We acknowledge that. He is much more important to us as our spiritual father. So when we get to Hosea chapter 11, we're looking at that rejection that symbolically went on with Hosea's children, and we're seeing sort of the other side of the coin. Because what was going on when Hosea married that prostitute and had those children was that God said, the prostitute is like Israel, the northern kingdom. Because at this point, the kingdom had been divided. There was Judah, whose kings tended to be more faithful, and had Jerusalem, and had the temple. They conducted proper worship. And then there's the northern kingdom of Israel. Their temples in Samaria and in Bethel, I guess, also. I can't remember where the two places are now, because they didn't prepare them for it. But they have two temples, and they're not authorized by God, and they do their own thing, and they've rejected God's true forms of worship. And the kings just generally tend to be idolatrous and bad. So this northern kingdom of Israel is who we're talking about here today. Not the full united kingdom of Israel. And that Israel is represented by the harlot. And she has children, a generation that God has rejected because of the unfaithfulness of the harlot, right? That's the language that is being set up here, right? The northern kingdom has been unfaithful towards the Lord, and so her children are not his children. That generation is of questionable parentage. Maybe they're not even really God's kids, right? She's a prostitute. That's the whole point. She's going around having sex with a lot of different men. So Hosea has children, but are they really his children? And the symbolism is obvious from there. So when we're looking at God as the father of Israel, as the father of this northern kingdom, he speaks to them in the way a father would speak to a child that he loved and cared for, whether or not he was not actually the parent or not, whether or not he actually was responsible. He cares for this child and he is expressing his love for him. Verse 1 of chapter 11 goes like this. When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to the idols. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with the cords of a man with bonds of love, and I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws. I bent down and fed them. He says, I took care of these people. They were my kids to raise. This is my child whom I have cared for and put my love and effort and energy into. Out of Egypt I called my son. I taught him how to walk. Ephraim is another name for Israel here. This is the same person we're talking about. They will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria. He will be their king because they refuse to return to me. The sword will whirl against their cities and demolish their gate bars and consume them because of their counsels. So my people are bent on turning from me. Though they call them to the one on high, none at all exalts him. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am your God, and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. You see, God says, I'm your father, but I'm not like a man. I'm not like a mortal person. I don't consider things the same way. If you made your dad mad enough, he'd come and he'd make sure that you were dead, he says. If you went against your tribe enough, even your own father would make war against you. But he said, I'm not a man. I'm not like a mortal man. I am God. And God will execute not anger, but compassion against his people. He's not going to destroy Israel. He's not going to eliminate Ephraim. But he says there's going to be a punishment. There will be consequences because God cares for his child. Because he is the father who raised Israel. He was the one who brought them out of Egypt. He was the one who taught them how to walk. He's the one who gave them their footing in this promised land. So now that they're going to be taken away to captivity for punishment, it is a punishment, but it is not their destruction. Because he says, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Verse 10, they will walk after the Lord. He will roar like a lion. Indeed, he will roar, and his sons will come trembling from the west. And they will come trembling like birds from Egypt and like doves from the land of Assyria, and I will settle them in their houses, declares the Lord. God says, I'm going to put these people back into captivity, right? I brought them out of Egypt once, I'll bring them out of Assyria again. You're going to come home eventually. But you're going to do so in trembling and in fear. You're going to know who your dad is, and you're going to respect it. You're going to know who you're supposed to be honoring, and when I bring you back home, declares the Lord there in verse 11. Ephraim surrounds me with lies, and the house of Israel with deceit. Judah is also unruly against God, even against the Holy One who is faithful. You see, the problem is that the son had forgotten the father. But the father, knowing who he was, knowing what his relationship with his child was, that he raised him up, that he taught him how to walk, he gave him everything he needed to be equipped to move forward, he said, I'm not going to treat you harshly. Even if you're lying against me, even if you're acting deceitfully, even if you're unruly and you do not obey what I have to say, I'm still your father, and I'm going to treat you like a father should treat you. So, if we're asking, why is God our Father? It's not just simply a matter of creation, although we do owe him that much. It's a matter of how much he cares for us and the kind of work he does to make sure that we learn the lessons that we need to learn, that we can grow, we can move forward, we can be the kind of people that he would have us to be. I think it's very significant in all of this, and so I'm repeating it again, that God is specifically saying that he is going to conduct himself as our Father, but only in a way that God would set the example for. Like I said, a human father, if you raised an army against him and came after his own people, as the Israelites in the northern kingdom did against Judah, where you were trying to kill your own brothers and sisters effectively, right? A human father would be justified in fighting back, making sure you're punished, putting you to death. But God the Father says in verse 9, I will not execute my fierce anger, I will not destroy Ephraim again, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. He is a God who exercises compassion instead of retribution. And that is the model he also sets before us as human parents, as fathers specifically. God doesn't want you to be the one who makes sure that your kids get their just desserts. God doesn't want you to be the one who makes sure that they know who you are and that they're afraid because of the pain and the suffering and the righteous fury you're going to bring on them. But they know who you are because you're like God, that while there may be consequences, punishments may come, the actual results of your actions may come to fruit, that you ultimately will show compassion, you'll demonstrate a higher level of character, you'll be a better person than what you're even supposedly justified in exercising. That you can be like the Holy One of God and exercise this higher level of compassion because of who you are and who it is that you serve. It's sometimes kind of hard to look at these prophecies with these talk of like nations rebelling against God and their punishments through the various wars and exile and all of these other things that they had to go through at that time, and take those big lessons and apply them to us as individual people. But when we look at God the Father and his relationship to his people as his child, it becomes a lot more personal, a lot easier to see. God doesn't want to cause pain to anyone. He doesn't want to destroy his son, he said here in this passage we read today. But instead, he wants to make us like him, and he wants to save us. He wants us to come back home after the punishment is done. And I think that for us, that's one of the greatest things that we can continue to try to model, especially for parents, especially for fathers, is to not only look at God as an example of the great rule maker, the great protector, the powerful creator who will go to bat for his kids and make sure they're protected and be strong and be a fighter, but also the one who exercises compassion, exercises mercy, exercises the kinds of grace for those who may not even deserve it. And that's the kind of God we serve, and that's the kind of people we should be. Well, I hope this lesson has been beneficial for you today. I hope it's been something that you can take with you and apply to your lives. And I hope it's been encouraging to those fathers among us today who may have needed a word from God on what kind of a father he is to us. If you can't count yourself among his children just yet, if you haven't been baptized, we always like to offer the invitation after we have assembled for any of those who may need to partake in that. If you have any concerns that we can address through prayer or anything else that we can help you with, we offer for you to come and bring those before us now as we stand and